What's going on, everyone? John Matrix here. So this is a video that's been requested by a couple people, being that I think the Space Wolves Legion is the Legion that I would be interested in playing. Had a lot of people request me checking out this video from WesHammer. It's about how the Space Wolves went from trash to greatness, Warhammer 40K lore. So we're going to check that video out here. I apologize if you hear me clearing my throat or coughing a little bit. I'm fighting off cold at the moment here, so I'm a little phlegmy. So I apologize. I will try not to do that as much as I possibly can, or mute, my mic when I'm able to. Other than that, we also recently got partnered here on YouTube. So we got the memberships, section here on YouTube. That's a new thing. So I would appreciate it if you guys would just take a minute and just check that out. I would really mostly just want to see you guys, check it out so I can get your feedback as to any ideas or anything else you would like to see added to the current tiers that are there, or perhaps other tiers that could be created in between to get you guys some more benefit. I want to make sure that those of you out there that decide you want to go that next step and support me monetarily are getting, your money's worth out of them. Right now I've got things set up so you get some emotes that we can do when we do some live streams, get your name added to any of the videos that I put out, 24-hour early access to the majority of the videos that I put out, videos like this one, and I've got the this Horus Heresy, Horus Rising, book that I'm getting ready to start reading. We're gonna start doing some videos on that, so you get early access to stuff like that. And then at the tippity top tier, we'll have some exclusive, maybe movie nights or game nights, etc., and some other community, driven stuff that I would like to do for you guys. So just if you have a minute, take the time to look at that out, look through all that stuff, and just, like I said, just give me a little feedback. Let me know anything else you guys would like to see, any ideas that you might have to add to that, so that you guys can get, your value from that. So I greatly appreciate that. But now we've gone through all that, let's get into the video. Like I said, this is WesHammer, how the Space Wolves went from trash to greatness, Warhammer 40K lore. So we're going to check out, I guess, the lore of, the Space Wolves here, which, like I said, is probably my faction that I'm most interested in, or would be most interested in learning, about and playing on the tabletop. So let's check this out here.
1 year ago, I said one of the most controversial things that anyone has ever uttered within the Warhammer community. It was a hot take so hot that I was convinced it was going to start a full-scale uprising and be the end of my career as a lore tuber. But consequences be damned. I loudly and confidently stated that the Space Wolves, one of the most popular factions in all of 40K, actually kind of sucked. And the reaction
Heresy
was honestly not what I was expecting.
Cancel them now.
Don't get me wrong, there were certainly some unhinged comments, and maybe a tasteful death threat or two. But the response from even self-proclaimed diehard Space Wolf fans was actually kind of reasonable. However, a ton of people told me that I wasn't being fair, that I was judging my opinion on them solely on how they were portrayed in the Horus Heresy, that I needed to do my due diligence and read about them in 40K in order for my opinion to carry any kind of weight. But was this true? Were the Space Wolves of the modern setting really that radically different from their ancient counterpart? Now, sure, a lot can happen in 10,000 years.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say ancient. 10,000 years, yeah, that would be ancient, but also, these things have been established and been around for so long, like, what is ancient on that kind of scale, you know what I mean? I guess is what I'm getting to.
Not radically different from their ancient counterpart. Now, sure, a lot can happen in 10,000 years, but let's be honest, this is 40K we're talking about. Most factions look and act pretty damn similar no matter how much time has passed. In order to get to the bottom of this, I did a whole lot of reading into my least favorite faction in the entire setting, in order to, on one hand, challenge myself and see if mayhaps I had been wrong, and two, to see if my righteous hatred was actually justified. To start this video off, I'm going to give you my super spicy take on why I absolutely couldn't stand the 30K Wolves, why I thought they were the worst faction with some of the worst writing in all of the Horus Heresy, and then we're going to transition into everything that I've learned about them in 40K. And I'll tell you right now, it's kind of like night and day. It really is like reading about two completely different factions. Heads up, if I sound a little off in this video, I'm getting over being sick. I somehow managed to catch a cold going camping. That activity that's famous for having
Going out and
tons
touching
of
grass.
people around? Anyways, we've got a lot to cover in this video.
This video, I think, he put out a few days ago, so I wonder if he just caught the same thing I got and it's just going around, you know what I mean?
But before we dive headfirst into the Grimdark, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus.
If you're a fan of Warhammer 40,000, and more specifically the Space Wolves, then now is the absolute perfect time to start playing Tacticus, as Ragnar Blackmane, Wolf Lord of the Blackmane's great company, just got added to the game. This dude is supremely confident and always the first into the fray. Now, he may not be as headstrong
I'm assuming this is some kind of tactical mobile game.
Berserker Rage is still a furious hurricane of violence. As a diehard 40k fan, it blows me away just how many iconic heroes they managed to cram into this game, while making sure that each and every one of them feels incredibly unique and has a very specific role that they fill. The game currently has 14 unique factions and dozens of champions to collect and battle with more being added all the time. Tacticus is one of those games that's easy to learn but difficult to master due to its complex system
Those
of
are always the best.
passive abilities, as well as powerful active abilities that can turn the tide in even the hardest of battles. Matches are fast-paced and intense, which makes it super easy to pick up and
Wonder if
play.
this is
There's
single
so much you
player or
can do in this
PvP.
game that if I ever get stuck on a particularly hard fight, I can jump into a different game mode to hone my skills and level up my squad in order to go back and dominate whatever roadblock I happen to hit. You can download the game for free today by clicking on the link in the description of this video or scanning my QR code here on the screen. And when you log in, use the code WesBlackmane11 to get a huge free reward of 2,000 coins, 200 Blackstone, and 2 requisition orders in order to give yourself a big head start. And if you're already playing the game, that code works for you too. None of that only for new players nonsense like in some other games. Big thanks to Warhammer Tacticus for sponsoring this video. As I mentioned in the intro of this video, for the longest time I was not a fan of the Space Wolves, and I said some pretty damning things about them in a few of my previous videos, which is not the norm for me. I tend to like everything in Warhammer, and I do admit I have a reputation for calling everything my favorite thing. It's actually genuinely hard for me to...
I can be that way sometimes. I can be that way sometimes too, because some things are just so cool that it's like, it's hard to choose. Like I said, like, the Grey Knights sound pretty badass, and I would very much like to learn about them too. But also the Nurgle Chaos Space Marines faction and the Tzeentch Chaos Space Marine faction, they sound pretty sick too. And I would probably have fun playing those, you know, factions. So I can definitely fall into that category of it's easy to like say this is my favorite, you know, all the time.
For calling everything my favorite thing. It's actually genuinely hard for me to find something that I don't like in this setting. That wasn't the case with the Wolves. I absolutely hated the 6th Legion. I just found myself constantly and consistently having my experience lessened with a novel whenever they showed up.
I've said this numerous times, anything Greek, Egyptian, or Norse, you know, anything to do with those mythologies, Greek, Egyptian, and Norse, like, I'm just a sucker for it. So it's no wonder that, you know, Space Wolves and, you know, the Tzeentch Space Chaos Marines factions and like the Necrons and stuff like that are like the stuff I'm kind of most interested in.
And consistently having my experience lessened with a novel whenever they showed up. This was mostly due to the fact that my introduction to them was through the Horus Heresy. I never really personally had much interest in them, so I avoided reading their 40k novels, and it painted a really bad picture of the Fenris. However, after I made those videos, I got a lot of comments from you guys saying that their 40k version was a lot different, and I should give them a chance.
That's honestly, it's making me more eager to read some more of these books then, because I would want to learn more about the Space Wolves lore in the 30k and just to see the comparison in the 40k. That's making me want to dive into them even more.
From you guys saying that their 40k version was a lot different, and I should give them a chance, because I'd probably end up liking them. So that's what I did, and I'm here to fully eat crow and admit that I was wrong. The 40k Wolves are awesome. They're a genuine joy to read about. But I'm gonna put a big old caveat
Ragnar
here.
Space
I
Marine.
still despise the way they're portrayed in 30k. And to better understand the massive difference between both iterations of the Fenris, I'm gonna need to go back to the Horus Heresy and
just the name or the term Fenris. I think that's how he's saying it. Even that just sounds badass.
between both iterations of the Valka Fenrique.
Valka
I'm gonna need to
Fenrique.
go back to the Horus Heresy
That just sounds
and set
dope.
the groundwork for their dramatic transformation. I'm gonna be retreading some territory that I've already covered in other videos, so if you don't want to hear me rant about how the Space Wolves of the Great Crusade are the absolute worst, then just go ahead and skip to the next part of this video. I'm gonna put this as gently as possible. The Space Wolves from the Horus Heresy fucking suck. Even in a galaxy full of people that seem to pride themselves on their hypocrisy, the Space Wolves stand apart as the biggest and worst hypocrites in the entirety of the setting. And hey, hypocrisy and 40k characters can often go hand in hand.
Right.
That's
That
not
seems like it's the
necessarily
norm.
problem. The problem is that they are never challenged on their hypocrisy. They're never forced to confront their own hubris and are never given an opportunity for growth, whether that be from a character or faction in universe or the narrative itself, as the text of the novels will often bend over backwards to pat them on the back, treating their mistakes, stupid decisions, and inability to have any form of self-reflection that challenges their way of thinking as somehow an honorable quality. Frankly speaking, they are written in a way that is nearly identical to how the Chaos Legions are portrayed. The major difference being that with the traitors, all of these negative traits are directly challenged. They have consequences and are punished for their arrogance.
I mean, they do seem like, from what I've seen and how they're portrayed, the Space Wolves do seem like the most violent faction, I guess, out of the loyalists, and would probably be looked at as the one that would be most likely to turn, maybe? I don't know. But yeah, they seem like they would probably be the most violent, most independent, you know, most willful, most not wanting to follow any other kind of doctrine, you know, most likely to want to do their own thing out of any of the other legions.
Traits are directly challenged. They have consequences and are punished for their arrogance. This never happens with the Wolves, which for me makes them incredibly frustrating to read about. Take possibly their biggest hypocrisy, their views on Psychers. They view anyone who utilizes the powers of the warp as a witch that needs to be eradicated. Yet meanwhile, they're doing the exact same thing with the Rune Priest. They claim it's different because they touch some grass and say a quick prayer to Mother Fenris before casting a spell, and they claim that they're only using 1% of their true power, as if this somehow makes it okay.
You know, it's also kind of interesting too, is like, you know, they almost have a religious, you know, overtone with, you know, Mother Fenris, and, you know, are they worshiping this Mother Fenris? You know, do they have a religion based around that? And obviously that goes against what the Emperor would want.
That they're only using 1% of their true power, as if this somehow makes it okay. If that was the case, then why not share their secrets of rune magic with the rest of the legions? Why not make that knowledge widely available? Because it's a lie. One that they've told themselves so many times that they forget that they're lying and have fully bought into their own propaganda. They act as if they are the only ones that are capable of wielding it appropriately, yet over on Chagoris with the White Scars, their version of sorcery is nearly identical. However, the major difference there is that the White Scars are not a legion of hypocrites like the Wolves are. They defended Magnus the Red and the Thousand Sons at the Council of Nicaea. Now, it's true that Jagatai warned Magnus that he needed to be careful and limitations were important, but they understood that psychic abilities were not inherently evil. They were a tool that could be used for great good if respected and used appropriately. The Space Wolves' continued use of psychic abilities will
I mean, you could say that about a lot of things that are deemed, you know, bad. You know, if certain things are used properly, you know, they can be used for good. I mean, there's a lot of illegal drugs that, you know, have had proven studies of having great benefits when used properly and in, you know, minuscule doses. You benefit people as opposed to, you know, having too much of it. I mean, even, you know, you look at something as basic as salt. Like, salt is a basic mineral that we need, but obviously if we have too much of it, it can cause, you know, blood pressure and circulation problems. So, you know, that's just kind of how everything is. You know, the psychic powers wouldn't be any different, you know, if used properly and in moderation and supervised in certain ways. Yeah, it could be used as a benefit, but obviously it's also a tool for the demons to corrupt you.
respected and used appropriately. The Space Wolves' continued use of psychic abilities while going after the Thousand Sons for doing the exact same thing is truly an example of denouncing something as evil in public, yet continuing to do the exact same thing themselves. Laws are made for thee, but not for me. In the same vein, they pointed to the flesh change of the Thousand Sons as evidence for their corruption. Yet by this point in time, the curse of the Wulfen had made itself known, and they had had multiple Space Wolves go full-blown werewolf. The absolute worst thing that ever happened with them during the Horus Heresy was the burning of Prospero. Now don't get it twisted, the Prosperian story arc is incredible. It's got excellent writing, it's heartbreaking, it's one of the best story arcs in the entirety of the Horus Heresy. But every single element about the Wolves' involvement in it is horrendously stupid and badly written. First and foremost, Leman Russ, the worst Primarch, only initiated the burning of Prospero because he was tricked by Horus. His direct orders from the Emperor were to capture Magnus alive so he could stand trial, and Horus changed the message to kill Magnus and the Thousand Sons. He didn't even question this. It's exactly what he wanted. He just needed an excuse. Even Constantine Valdor, who was with him at the time and participated in the battle, stated that this did not sound like what the Emperor would have wanted. And let me be 100% clear about the burning of Prospero. In the lore, it's treated like this spectacular moment in history. A bombastic, over-the-top battle, a clashing of titans. And that's true in a sense, but what it actually was a genocide.
Yeah, it was a genocide.
Was a massacre.
And it forced Magnus and his legion to get corrupted. They had to escape through the warp, which was a trap, I believe, by Tzeentch. And, you know, then they ended up getting corrupted, and, you know, that legion fell to chaos gods, you know, so all it did was create a greater enemy for them.
What it actually was a genocide. It was a massacre. Over 30 million people lost their lives.
Wow.
The vast majority of them being civilians. The novel A Thousand Sons is a great book, one of my favorites in the entirety of the Horus Heresy, but it doesn't really do a great job of portraying just how bloody this battle was. If you want to get a sense of this, then track down the Horus Heresy Black Book Inferno. The first half of the actual fight itself is just the wolves massacring civilians. Now, a few times during the battle, they tried to claim that they only attacked civilians if they were armed, which of course they were. There were tons of different bands of civilian militias that had formed as their world was being invaded.
They're trying to protect
they were
themselves.
Defending their homes. They had absolutely no chance against Space Marines. And bear in mind, other than the Prosperian Guard, who were members of the Astra Militarum that were stationed on Prospero, the vast majority of these people were not soldiers. They didn't know how to fight, and their weapons couldn't even chink the ceramite armor of the Space Wolves. So it was just a massacre. And not that it would somehow justify the Space Wolves' actions if this somehow wasn't the case, but bear in mind that these people are Imperium citizens. The wolves were slaughtering their own people, and these people were being attacked by the ones that were supposed to keep them safe. And even
well, and I mean, that kind of goes along with the Viking nature that the Space Wolves are based on. You know, there's numerous, you know, accounts in history of, you know, various Viking tribes and raids doing similar things, warring against other Viking, you know, tribes and kings, and slaughtering innocents and pillaging and doing all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, that kind of goes in line with the Viking nature of this legion. So, I can understand, I guess, from like a lore perspective, it kind of feeling more accurate, you know, I guess. But also, and I mean, at the time, Horus was the War Master and had not, you know, shown his true colors to have turned to the chaos yet. And so Horus's word was the word of the Emperor. So, you know, him not thinking or him not essentially checking those orders, you know, I wouldn't necessarily think that would be something that he probably would do, right? You know, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's other instances in other books where something like that similar has happened, where Horus gave an order to one of the Primarchs or one of the other legions, and they questioned him, and it turned out to be, you know, a proper order that was relayed from the Emperor. You know, I don't know, but him not questioning Horus's order to kill them especially if they had already shown to be corrupted, or that there was some corruption going on, you know. I would think that's just, you know, a normal, valid thing.
Even the idea of letting civilians live if they didn't have a gun is a concept that goes right out the window on multiple occasions throughout the book. The most horrific scene to me is when Leman Russ first joined in the fighting, as it serves as a perfect example of how the narrative twists itself to make these guys into heroes, when in reality, they're nothing but idiotic, hypocritical butchers. The wolves had pressed into the city, and at this point, within only an hour or so, the death toll was in its hundreds of thousands. The Thousand Sons themselves hadn't directly got involved yet. There's a scene where hordes of terrified civilians are moving through the bloodstained streets, desperately seeking sanctuary. They moved towards the gate of an ancient fortress that had been hastily put into service, known as the Acropolis Magna. The problem was, there were so many people pressed up against the gates that they couldn't get them open. Even worse, the turrets and all of the guns that had been placed here were bogged down in so many bodies that they couldn't be brought to bear against the wolves, who at this point were marching in, with the Wolf King himself, Leman Russ, leading the pack. In the text itself, the story actually cuts off here and instead gives us an excerpt from one of the Space Wolves in 40K's myths about the event. And this is what it had to say. And so did the King of Wolves come upon the servants of his warp-touch brother, finding them sealed within the iron hearth that served as their lair. Where the Raven's friends could not reach with their bright sea flames, the Ringbreaker of the Six took hold of the hearth's maw, his mighty thews straining at the effort and pried it asunder, breaking the jaws apart. Across the smash gullet of the fortress, the steeds of midnight, the sons of Fenris, came howling for the blood of the foe, and within the span of heartbeats, there was left only food for the crows. Looking upon the work of his children, the broken corpses of the foe, the Wolf King judged it well and good. A few paragraphs later, it talks about how one of the strategies the wolves would use was to herd civilians in the direction of the last remaining holdouts of Prosperian Guard. In this way, they would be so choked by refugees that they would be easily and effectively neutralized. Now, here's the thing. Super bloody, grimdark stuff like this is par for the course when it comes to Warhammer, but it's never portrayed as this super heroic thing without a whole bunch of caveats, a very specific subtext, or a character telling us just how horrible it actually was, that it was a necessary evil that had to be done. On the other hand, when those caveats aren't there, the act is normally being perpetuated by characters that are being portrayed as the bad guys, like Chaos or Xenos. As then, there's no need for the subtext. The entirety of the text is showing us that this is an evil, unforgivable act. So again, the wolves' actions are more aligned with a chaos faction than a loyalist one. I tell you all of this because I really want to make it clear that this is the reason I had avoided their books for so long.
It's understandable.
And don't get me wrong, I love reading about the villains. The chaos factions are some of my favorites.
I can understand, you know, his perspective on it. And I'm not, like, defending one way or the other. I just think they're written because they're space Vikings, you know? And that's kind of like what Vikings did when... You know, when battle started, they went all in until it ended. And a lot of times, yeah, civilians would get in the way and they would be killed or, you know, put into slavery and a lot of other terrible things. So, I mean, I feel like they're just written to be space Vikings, and that's kind of their behavior, you know what I mean? So...
But if the text was trying to tell me that they were actually the good guys and every single thing that they were doing was super duper justified.
But yeah, I could see his point right there, though, where like they're trying to portray them as the good guys because they're the loyalists. I guess maybe the way it's written is just like that's how history sees it. And maybe it's just trying to be written from the perspective. I mean, I don't know. I haven't read the books yet, so I'm just trying to kind of play devil's advocate, I guess, in that, you know, because there's a section of it that was written as an excerpt being told by a future Space Wolf talking about the past. Maybe that's how it's intended to kind of be viewed and written. That, you know, this is, you know, history written by the victor, you know, so obviously they see themselves as the good guys, and this was something that was necessary, needed to be done.
I don't think I would enjoy that. But that's what's happening with the 30K Space Wolves. I assumed it was going to be the exact same thing with them in 40K, as for the most part, even though 10,000 years have passed, there's a solid through line with each of the legions between their modern interpretation and their ancient ancestors. Ultramarines are still Ultramarines.
Right, not much has
Salamanders are
changed.
still Salamanders. Even with the Chaos Legions, who have undergone dramatic transformations, they make sense with their story arc. The obsession with perfection of the Emperor's children leading them down a path of damnation that twisted them into a degenerate pack of excess-addicted hedonites makes sense. The Death Guard being a legion of attrition-style warfare specialists that were tough as nails and ritualistically drank poison for fun, being turned into the Plague Marines makes sense. So, like I said before, I assumed it would be the same with the Wolves. And I'm here to tell you that I was incredibly wrong about this. The Space Wolves of the 41st and 42nd millennium are awesome and a radically different legion that is actually a genuine joy to read about. Okay, so now that you've made it all the way through my long-winded rant about the Space Wolves, now is the part of the video where I eat crow, where I fully admit that I was wrong about these guys and provide evidence to support the fact that I'm kind of an idiot. And to do that, I want to highlight 3 specific examples of the Space Wolves being awesome. Those are the Months of Shame, because it's a classic, the return of the Wulfen in Zone Fenris, and a short story that I read recently from the Successors book about a Space Wolf delegation going to meet their first successful successor chapter, the Wolf Spear. If you don't know much about the Months of Shame, I'm going to give you an abridged version of it here because I do plan on covering it more in depth in the future. The basic gist of it is that this is a period in time that took place directly after the First War for Armageddon, after Angron and his forces had been defeated. The Inquisition determined that for the greater good, all of the human fighters that had taken part in the battle and had witnessed the horrors of chaos firsthand would need to be eradicated in order to keep that information from spreading out into the public and to contain any potential chaos corruption that may have taken root in their souls. The Space Wolves had fought to defend the people of this world and were not told about the Inquisition's intentions, but Logan Grimnar was suspicious, so right after the battle ended, he ordered his fleet to stay in orbit. And sure enough, his suspicions would be well-founded, as all of the civilians that lived on this planet were going to be rounded up and put into forced labor camps where they would be sterilized and then effectively be worked to death. All of the forces of the Astra Militarum that were attempting to leave had their ships fired upon by the Grey Knights. As soon as this began, the Space Wolves immediately sprang into action, putting their ships in between both sides and getting caught in the line of fire. Their quick action saved the lives of tens of thousands of people, as the troop transports were able to get away. But it wasn't over. Now, after the fact, the Lord Inquisitor, who was in charge of this entire thing, ordered the Grey Knights to go out and exterminatus any planet that any single one of those soldiers came into contact with, even if their troop transports were simply stopping their—
Damn, they went to the they gave the exterminatus order to wipe out whole planets that any of these people, any of the survivors of this battle potentially went to. That's pretty extreme, man. Wiping out whole planets.
Single one of those soldiers came into contact with, even if—
I mean, I get it's, you know, the potential for entire worlds to be corrupted is there by even just one person. So I get that, but just outright ordering exterminatus on any of those planets without doing any other kind of investigation to make sure that those people are in fact corrupted or not.
Exterminatus any planet that any single one of those soldiers came into contact with, even if their troop transports were simply stopping there for a day to refuel. Now, likewise, the Inquisition itself began to hunt them down, destroying several of these ships while they were in warp transit. Once again, the Space Wolves came to their aid, tracking down those ships and protecting them, or going to those worlds and getting in the way so the Grey Knights couldn't blow them up. The biggest thing to bear in mind here is that the Space Wolves never returned fire. Not a single shot, no matter how many of their battle brothers died or how much damage their ships sustained. They knew that if they fought back, that was the only excuse the Inquisition would need to declare them excommunicate Traitoris. Now, after a certain point, the Inquisition seemed like it was agreeing to a ceasefire and called them to a neutral location to discuss terms. But as soon as the Space Wolves showed up, they opened fire, destroying 4 of the 5 ships that had appeared in orbit. Logan Grimnar was furious and teleported aboard the Lord Inquisitor's flagship, feigning a surrender. When he got there, he had some pretty strong words for him.
I would say so.
Someone who would openly spit on the tradition of parley and diplomacy. Now, when it was revealed that the at the time Grand Master of the Grey Knights had ordered the attack, Logan Grimnar used his magical power axe to cut him in half. And then him and the Terminators that had been escorting him killed the remaining Grey Knights before teleporting away.
Damn, they took out the Grey Knights? Or Grey Knight, you know, squad or whatever? That's pretty fucking badass.
Him and the Terminators that had been escorting him killed the remaining Grey Knights before teleporting away. And after this point, it was basically a full-blown war between the Space Wolves, the Grey Knights, and the Inquisition. And the Space Wolves showed no mercy to any of their ships they encountered. To say that the Lord Inquisitor was furious is a huge understatement. Not so much for the loss of lives. He didn't really care much about that.
Of course
not.
not.
For the sheer audacity of the wolves for ignoring his orders. This wasn't about revenge. It was about authority. He wanted the wolves, and more specifically, their
his
chapter
authority
master,
was openly challenged
before him on their knees, begging for forgiveness. So a massive Inquisition fleet went to Fenris with an ultimatum: either go on a penitent crusade for your crimes or be destroyed. They were fully expecting the wolves to comply with this, because why would you want to have your historic chapter just wiped out? But when they got there, they very quickly realized that the Valka Fenrique had no intention of surrendering. When they got there, it seemed like nobody was home. There was only a single wounded ship in orbit. But shortly after this, the entirety of the Space Wolves fleet arrived, and a huge battle ensued, with massive losses on both sides. Now, after a while of fighting, Bjorn the Fell-Handed managed to convince Grimnar to stand down. There had been too much fighting and too much blood spilled on both sides, to which the Space Wolves and the Inquisition begrudgingly agreed. The Inquisition would limp away with their tail between their legs that day, and although it seemed like everything was going back to normal, the Wolves never forgot what happened during this year-long conflict.
I wouldn't either.
And hostility still bubbles just under the surface to this day. To their credit, the Grey Knights look back on this period of time with great sadness and humility, and they're actually the ones who came up with the term Months of Shame. Now, after hearing all about the Months of Shame, I want you to compare that to the burning of Prospero. Regardless of how you feel about the Wolves, the Thousand Sons, whether or not you think the Sons deserved what they got, whether they had it coming, anything like that, the human population of Prospero was not spared the brutality of the Wolves. Over 30 million civilians were massacred. Compare that to the 40K wolves, who are willing to risk everything to stand up for what is right.
Willing to risk their
not only
destruction of their faction
to defend the citizens of the Imperium
and their homeworld,
put themselves in the direct line of fire and have the restraint to not fight back. I think this is a great example of just how much the Space Wolves have changed. But the funny thing is, I haven't been able to find a specific example of when that change occurred. It honestly seems like it came about when Leman Russ disappeared. But hey, I would never...
I mean, I could see that making sense, you know. Their Primarch is their leader, and their actions would be reflection of their leader. So if Leman Russ disappears, and that was what his attitude really was, you know, their attitude over the years, you know, and conduct would change based on whoever their leadership is, you know. That's just how those things go.
It honestly seems like it came about when Leman Russ disappeared. But hey, I would never insinuate that the worst Legion got a whole lot better when the worst Primarch suddenly vanished. That would be irresponsible and ridiculous. Instead, let's talk about the events of Zone Fenris, as it's a great example of why the modern Space Wolves are so much better than their Horus Heresy counterparts. At one point during this campaign, these Space Wolves encountered a massive amount of Wulfen. It was revealed that this had been the missing 13th Great Company that had disappeared after going through a portal on Prospero in an attempt to chase down a Thousand Sun sorcerer and those under his command. I actually went over the Wulfen in this particular moment in time in pretty extensive detail in a different video, so check that out if you want to know more.
We'll have to check that out too.
But the major takeaway is that when the Space Wolves were presented with a situation wherein they met a bunch of clearly mutated Marines, and one of their primary tenets is to suffer not the mutant to live, they reacted in a way that you wouldn't expect. They took them in. They did everything they could to protect them by going on a massive journey to gather them all up after they had been dislodged after exiting the Eye of Terror. Now, just to be clear, a lot of the Space Wolf higher-ups had differing opinions on the situation. One of them wanted to gather them all up because they could prove to be a valuable weapon, while others felt that bringing them all together was the best way of keeping them hidden, because if the Inquisition caught wind of a bunch of werewolf Space Marines, that would draw some pretty uncomfortable conclusions about the chapter. But the idea of simply culling them was never on the table. When the Dark Angels caught wind of what was happening and went to inspect, they found the Wulfen and immediately tried to kill them. But the Space Wolves got between them. The Dark Angels were like, dude, I understand that those used to be Space Wolves and all, but I mean, just look at them. We're not talking about just some minor mutation here. Those are full-blown werewolves.
Straight up werewolves, brother.
And let us do what needs to be done. And the Space Wolves...
I mean, you could easily see that being, you know, a corruption of chaos, turning, you know, people into straight up full-blown werewolves in, you know, Space Marine armor. And I mean, how terrifying would that be? I would assume that they would have all the strength, speed, and enhancement of an Astartes, while also the extra strength, speed, and enhancement, healing, etc., of being a werewolf, and still having the armor and armaments of a Space Marine. That would be terrifying.
Those are full-blown werewolves. Stand down and let us do what needs to be done. And the Space Wolves were like, absolutely not. We're not going to allow you to hurt them. You need to turn around and go back the way you came. The Dark Angels told them point blank that if they tried to stop them, then this would be a declaration of war. And the Space Wolves didn't flinch. They didn't give a fuck. They were like, we're not gonna let you hurt them, dude. Consequences be damned. There's even a point where the Grey Knights get involved, and they've caught wind of what's going on with the Wulfen. And Logan Grimnar stares them down and is like, I don't know what you think you've heard, but I promise you you're wrong. And pressing the matter any further with me is not a wise decision. He's
Man's
so
a badass.
awesome. And you know, mutants get kind of a bad deal in the war-torn galaxy of the 41st millennium.
I would bet,
and for
yeah.
me, having been somebody who most of my reading about the wolves came from the Horus Heresy, this came so out of left field for me, and it was honestly just such a refreshing change of pace. You pretty much never see anybody stand up for mutants, let alone the Space Wolves. This is one of those key moments where my opinion on them really started to change. But the final nail in the coffin for my Space Wolf hate would come a little while later when I started reading through all the anthology books. And I'm not gonna lie to you, this is a much smaller story with smaller implications. But it's these short, humanizing stories to me that are my favorite part about 40K. The short story in question is simply called The Wolves, and it details the rise of the Primaris chapter of Space Wolves known as the Wolf Spears. If you know anything about the Space Wolves, you know that they don't have any successor chapters. The first couple of attempts they had in making them ended in disaster due to some Thousand Sons fuckery. So this is kind of a big deal. This is their first successful successor chapter.
I don't know what successor chapters are. I'm assuming that's like a derivative chapter that's kind of like a subfaction of them, I guess. You know? So let me know in the comments what the successor chapters are. I can't even talk right now. My brain just isn't working, man.
Fuckery. So this is kind of a big deal. This is their first successful successor chapter, and the Wolf Spears, for the most part, are not born of Fenris. They were all taken as children by Call's agents from all over the galaxy. They don't really know anything about their homeworld and have never met any other Space Wolves. So when the Space Wolf delegation shows up, they're super excited but also nervous about it. This meeting kinda came out of nowhere and didn't have any warning, so they're scrambling to put everything together, get into parade formation, and look presentable for their guests. These are their respected brothers, people that they look up to, but they've never met them, and they really want to impress their older siblings. When their ship touches down, 3 Space Wolves step out to greet the warriors. One, a Primaris Marine who has crossed the Rubicon named Yarman, one Firstborn named Troels, and a Wolf Priest named Ulfria. When the Wolf Priest goes to speak, he addresses them with a slightly mocking tone, noting that there isn't very many of them and not to be too flattered, they were sending delegates out to meet all of the new Primaris chapters. If this had been the 30K Space Wolves, I do not for a moment think that the leader of the pack wouldn't have spit in their face and mocked them for not being true Valka Fenrique, for knowing nothing of Fenris or their traditions and being nothing more than a bunch of pretenders and LARPers. But that's not what happens here. In fact, far from it, their interaction is actually kind of amazing and heartfelt. Now don't get it twisted, the Wolf Priest is definitely messing with them. He's acting super stern and gruff,
right,
and talking about how he's going to judge them all harshly and see if they're worthy to call themselves Space Wolves. But the reality is, behind this gruff demeanor, he's actually kind of excited to see these new wolves. He's come to teach them everything he can about the traditions of the Valka Fenrique, of their history of Fenris, and the legacy of Leman Russ. When he addresses the crowd, only a couple of the Primaris Marines here are actually born of Fenris, but again, they were super young when they were kidnapped by Call's agents, so they don't know anything of their homeworld. He points out one of them because of the markings on his helmet and asks him if he's a lieutenant, and the Marine jokingly says that that's what the stripes on his helmet indicate. The Wolf Priest can't help himself. He belly laughs and says that he likes him. He plans on using him as an intermediary between him and the Primaris Marines, because he's well aware that his Fenrisian manners are not to everyone's taste, and it would certainly help in the teaching process if he had someone born of Fenris to work with him. Then he does something that is completely uncharacteristic of the Space Wolves if you're looking at them back in 30K. He turns to the chapter master and asks him if that is okay, if he gives him permission to take this lieutenant under his wing. And the chapter master accepts. The lieutenant's name was Bjarni Arvidsson, and Ulfriða takes him to the side and tells him that they have a lot of work to do. There was a lot he had to teach them. But before they could get all that underway, there was something very important that had to happen first. There was a pause, and the three Space Wolves looked at each other and then back at Bjarni. He looks at them and asks, "You want ale, don't you?" The three Space Wolves look super excited, and one of them even says that this guy is definitely a true son of Fenris. All jokes aside, yes, that is absolutely what they wanted. Ulfriða tells him it had been a long journey across the stars, and their thirst was great. The scene cuts to later that night, and they're all gathered in the food hall drinking heavily. Unfortunately, the ale that these guys have is not up to the Fenrisians' taste. One of the Space Wolves spits it out onto the ground in a big dramatic fashion, standing up and saying how
Very
disgusting
Viking.
it is. How can you drink this horse piss?
Making a big
There's
display.
Just kind of an awkward silence that hangs in the air after this moment. The Space Wolf in question then does something else that is unthinkable for a Space Wolf. He apologizes and says that that was out of line and sits back down. But he comments that the Primaris chapter doesn't seem to joke around or talk much. The younger man is oddly quiet. There's a battle raging in his mind. Sure, he was born of Fenris, but he doesn't know anything about it. He doesn't have any memories of that place and knows practically nothing about his homeworld. He was raised to worship the Sky Warriors, and he technically is one, but he's not a Space Wolf. He feels like a counterfeit, like an imposter, and even though he doesn't admit it openly, he desperately wants the approval of these older men. Another one of them says that ale is ale, and that he clearly had better manners than his brother did. But even still, this guy needed to learn to answer an insult. He didn't look like a Space Marine. He looked nervous, like a maiden on her wedding night. And to this, the Wolf Priest has something to say.
Leave him be, Yaman. You do not answer. I understand. To admit weakness is hard. But I have seen that look, the one you have on your face right now, the one on the faces of many others. Yours is not the first Ultima Pack we have visited. We are a singular chapter of great and noble heritage. We are bred of an unusual world. We've had few successors until now. The situation is unique in our history. Before now, we have not enjoyed the extended brotherhood the other legions have maintained. There are not untold numbers of Lord Russ's sons, as there are of Guilliman or Sanguinius. But it is hardest of all, I think, to be a Fenris, and to be a Space Marine, and not be of the great companies.
The younger Primaris Marine tells him that he doesn't know how to explain how he feels, that he's a Space Wolf, but he's not a Space Wolf.
Right.
And one of the others snaps at him and tells him not to use that name, that was for the outsiders. They were the Velka Fenrika. The Wolf Priest tells him to cut him some slack. He would know that if he hadn't been taken from Fenris against his will, but he can see it in his eyes. He knows that if he had remained on Fenris, he would have been chosen. He was a great judge of men, but there was one thing that his brothers were in fact right about. The ale was terrible. The next lesson was starting right now, and was one of the most important things about the Velka Fenrika. He tells him to listen well. They would teach him of Njord. Later on in the story, the two groups end up battling against an incursion of Khorne demons together, as that was the entire purpose of the Wolf Spears. They were stationed on this world as warp portals had been continuously spawning every night, and demons were pouring through. What follows is an amazing, albeit kind of short battle scene due to the nature of this being a short story, wherein Bjarni actually manages to defeat a Herald of Khorne in one-on-one combat.
Really?
An act that the Wolf Priest was incredibly impressed by.
I mean, yeah, to be able to kill a Herald, which I believe is like a greater demon, you know, one-on-one, and you're not even like part of a Space Marine chapter. You haven't necessarily been, trained properly. Pretty big feat, even among Space Marines.
Herald of Khorne in one-on-one combat, an act that the Wolf Priest was incredibly impressed by. After the fighting was done, the Wolf Priest says that he has made a full assessment of the chapter. Before he turns to take his leave, he tells them that he has one final thing to say to them. You never were and never will be a Space Wolf. but you and your men are of the Valka Fenrika, and they honor them as their brothers. He tells them to look to the sky and see their true purpose. Bjarni looks up and sees multiple Space Wolf ships touching down. The Wolf Priest explains that they were reinforcements, his men. No, correction, your men. That they had brought enough reinforcements to bring the chapter up to Gilliman's 1000. He didn't think for a second that 3 Space Wolves would travel all the way across the galaxy alone, did he? The ships had been waiting just outside of auger range for his signal. And to the younger man's puzzlement, he says that means he must have sent the signal hours ago. The Wolf Priest tells him that he did the moment battle was joined, for he saw a true brotherhood worthy of Russ. After hearing all of that, I'm sure you're wondering, at the end of the day, has my
Pretty dope little story. Pretty dope little story. Honestly, it's making me want to read these books even more and dive even more into the lore of this chapter.
Worthy of Russ. After hearing all of that, I'm sure you're wondering, at the end of the day, has my opinion changed on the Space Wolves? Yes, it absolutely has. But am I a massive Space Wolf fanboy now? No, not really. But I do have a lot more respect for them, and I can officially confirm that I very much enjoy their 40K version. But I still despise them in 30K. The Wolves went from being a bunch of hypocritical, moronic assholes to honorable warriors steeped in tradition that genuinely give a shit about saving humanity and defending the innocent. The whole bit with the Wulfen where they stood up for a bunch of mutants, never in a billion years would the 30K Space Wolves do something like that. Standing up to the Inquisition or the Dark Angels, now that's not that far out of the realm of possibility to be fair, but they wouldn't do it to protect people. It would be for some stupid reason, like going to war over a perceived insult. There's been a lot of rumors about who the next Primarch to return to the setting will be, and for me, I really hope it's not Leman Russ. As without him around, it sure does seem like his sons are in a much better place. But maybe there's hope. Lionel Johnson is a totally different character now. He's older and wiser, and not only had he learned some humility, but he grew up enough to actually seek forgiveness and apologize for the mistakes of his past. Which, you know, if I'm just speaking from the heart to you, that's one of the manliest things that you can do in my opinion. I absolutely cannot stand hypocrites and people who are incapable of admitting wrongdoing. The Lions novel was amazing. If they decide to bring Leman Russ back in a similar pretense, where he's like a wise old Odin figure, oh, that would be fucking awesome. I would be on board with that. But if it's the same incarnation of the Leman Russ that we know from 30K, I have a feeling that everything that's good about the Space Wolves, or at least what
I mean, it's been 10,000 years, so, you know, you would think someone would change along that time. Especially if, you know, he went into the Eye of Terror, like some of the lore says, and he's, you know, been fighting the forces of chaos this whole time, or for at least a good, you know, portion of it.
That we know from 30K, I have a feeling that everything that's good about the Space Wolves, or at least what I personally enjoy, is going to be ruined. But what are your thoughts on all this? Are you a fan of the Space Wolves? Do you like them in 30K and in 40K, or only one over the other? Did I fundamentally miss the mark with how they're represented? And what do you think is going to happen when Leman Russ actually comes back? Is the setting gonna go full-blown wolf time? Is he gonna come back as a feral 10-foot-tall space marine werewolf, or a wise old patriarch that guides his sons into a new age? I'll admit there's still a lot of Space Wolf reading material that I haven't touched yet. So let me know all of your recommendations for Space Wolf reading material down in the comment section below, as I'm definitely intrigued and want to know more about these guys. Anyways, that's all I had to say on this particular subject. Big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I'll catch you all in the next one.
All right, well, there you go. There you go. That was WesHammer with the how the Space Wolves went from trash to greatness. Warhammer 40K lore. Go check it out. I'll have the link down below in the description for this video and for his channel. Pretty interesting, you know, bit of lore and contrast. You know, they seemed very much more feral and aggressive, kind of berserker Viking in the 30K era, and they seem more honor tradition bound. I don't know if stoic necessarily is the right word or term, but I guess more reasonable, kind of, you know, Viking centric, you know, faction in the 40K version. It's honestly, him going over this just made me want to kind of dive in and read more of their story and lore to learn more about them. I would like to learn more about the origins of a lot of these different, you know, chapters. I mean, I guess if there is, you know, actual books, like I don't know if there is actual specific books that are specific origin stories of each of their Primarch's journeys and them forming their legions, you know, or not. If there are, let me know, because I would like to get into some of those as well and just learn more of how these different, you know, legions, you know, were formed and etc, etc. So, but great video. Definitely learned a lot more, and it's just made me want to learn more about them, you know, and more about some of these main characters. It would be interesting if Leman Russ returns, how they will portray him. The idea of him kind of coming back as a wizened, battle-hardened Odin kind of figure, going through that kind of hero's journey of being, you know, a young, brash, arrogant, you know, sounding fighter to a more wizened, thoughtful leader. You know, that would be interesting. It could also be interesting if, you know, it turns out that he did end up going into the Eye of Terra. I believe that's what one of the rumors is, and that he's been fighting chaos this whole time. And what if he comes back corrupted and he tries to, you know, turn his legion? You know, that could be an interesting story, and seeing, you know, how that would go. So, but good video, definitely good video. Definitely learn a lot more about the faction that I would be most interested in playing in the tabletop. So well, yeah, if you guys are watching this here to the very end, I greatly appreciate it. I greatly appreciate your time stopping in and checking out this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this video, consider leaving a like and a sub. As I said earlier, I am also partnered now here on YouTube, so if you want to check out the membership tiers and those benefits, you know, if you decide you want to go above and beyond the normal support of just, you know, watching the videos and maybe leaving a like and a comment, you know, that option's there. And at the very least, I would appreciate you checking out the various membership tiers and just giving me some feedback on, you know, things that you'd like to see either added to those tiers, or maybe some other tiers added in between, you know, some other options. So, but thanks again for watching, guys. Hope you are having a wonderful day wherever you are and whenever you're seeing this. And yeah, have a good one. See you on the next one, everybody.